Welcome to RPG Reanimators, a podcast for GMs where we dissect horror scenarios and offer our experiences and advice to reanimate it at the table. I'm Nathan.
I'm Lex.
And I'm Alex.
Let's see what's on the slab. The case report for this session is A Victim of the Art, which is a scenario written by Dennis Detwiller for Delta Green. In this scenario, a serial killer is at work in quiet Glen Ridge, Long Island. Bizarre mutilations mark the victims of the Glen Ridge chiropractor, as national news and the conspiracy theorists at Phenomenon X call the killer. Privately, the medical examiner is more troubled by residue found on the corpses, a pulpy, gray organic substance that defies analysis. When the police ask the FBI for help, Delta Green agents answer the call. Potential content and trigger warnings for this scenario include violence and child endangerment. As with any dissection, we'll be discussing all the gross standards of this scenario, so from this point on, there will be spoilers. If you're interested in playing this scenario, please stop here and share this episode with your GM so they can listen and consider running this for your group. We'll also include links for where you can purchase a copy of this scenario for yourself in the show notes of this episode. Now, with that out of the way, let's begin our dissection. So let's start. Lex, how are the players brought into this scenario?
Sure. So depending on if the handler wants to run this as a program game or an Outlaws game, this details some different setups for how that can be. Typically with the program, it will get sort of ushered up the chain with some random friendly who can then get the agents involved with the handler and issue people out from there. If it's from the Outlaws perspective, it could be that the coroner or some local person around town could be a friendly or informant that would then tip off someone in the chain to then send a cell in to investigate. The general setup is that there have been a string of seemingly random murders in a very brutal fashion throughout this quiet town in New York. And this savage ripping out of spines and skulls missing, combined with a mysterious fluid found under the murder victim's fingernails, is what really tips the group off in order to send the players in to investigate.
So let's talk about what's actually happening behind the handler's screen. Thomas Dengler, a high schooler, has obtained one of his grandfather's artifacts. It's a small statue of a silent one, or Eapa. This statue allows the wearer to command this Eapa to do their bidding. And this Eapa is a huge beast, a winged beast that flies throughout the air, and in mythology has helped civilizations build up their giant temples. So we have this hormonal teenager who acquires a deadly artifact that summons a monster that does his bidding. And whenever he goes to bed, he dreams and it follows whatever commands that subconsciously happen. And what he's dreaming of is the conflicts that he's gotten into as a teenage boy. So he might have had his wisdom tooth. No, it's not. Root canal?
I think it's a messy.
It was some dental surgery, but yeah.
Right. So he has a really messy dental surgery, or he gets rejected by a girl he likes, or he gets put into detention. So when he goes to bed at night unconsciously, this Eapa goes after these instigators and kills them. And he has no idea what's going on.
Right. And typically the price for commanding the Eapa to do one's bidding is to have a victim of the art as a human sacrifice in order to pay it for its dues. So in this case, this is sort of a perfect storm of a hormonal teenager who is subconsciously sending out this thing to go strike down those that have wronged him. And that thing gets a tasty spine out of the deal. So they seem to be happy as a clam in this relationship. And it's up to your players to try and shake this up.
And if that wasn't bad enough, there's also the continuing problem of the press, who is very interested in this phenomenon. And there are options in the text for Phenomenon X and Coral Nomad to show up. The first, a pesky thorn in the side of investigators, and the latter, a dangerous kill team ready to put down any leaks.
There aren't any key locations mentioned in the scenario itself. That's going to be up to the handler to come up with. Mostly, this is going to involve the Dangler household, most likely the school and the dentist's office, as well as the coroner's office.
Additionally, you'll find that players might involve Detective Hannah Gregson and the mother, Sandra Harrogate, of the latest victim. Along with Thomas Dangler, the summoner, you will also perhaps involve his father, Mark Dangler, and mother, Eloise Dangler.
As well as a hefty bit of detail for his grandfather, who is sort of the latent source of all of these goings on.
So, Alex, what's the beating heart of this scenario?
So some of the themes that I've identified in this scenario, just on my read through, is the theme of cat and mouse. Your agents are tracking this super predator, and they'll soon realize who is the cat and who is the mouse. There is the theme of growing up and high school drama, because we have Thomas Dangler, who is an angsty high schooler, and he is not in control of his emotions, and he gets upset. And when he gets upset, because of the artifact that he has, people die. And then there is another theme, if should you include it and emphasize it, which is the theme of surveillance and the media and who's watching who, which can be a fantastic addition when you want to have your agents look over their shoulders at all times.
One additional theme that I found as a player in this is your agents are likely going to hit a major ethical roadblock whenever they realize that the cause of all of these horrible murders is a kid who is not in control of these things. So they're likely going to have to come to a conflict of, it's probably easier and safer to kill him, but are you going to shoot an innocent teenager to hopefully stop all of this from happening? Are you going to try and talk him out of it and hope you don't piss him off enough that he's going to send some winged beastie after you? That's for your players to decide, and it often leads to very chaotic showdowns.
So let's talk a little bit more about general strengths and limitations of the scenario as written. Going through this, I found that the timeline and the map are excellent for any sort of investigation needs. They clearly identify what happened where and when, which is important as this tends to be a sandbox adventure. There are no set locations that investigators must go to. It usually will end with some climax confrontation at Thomas Dangler's household, though.
Right, sort of like a bottleneck sandbox that they can wander around, but as they get closer to the end, there's only so many ways that it can shake out.
You can see this in a lot of Art Dream's work, where the author gives a trail of clues to find, but the GM is ultimately responsible for creating the situation around those clues.
And I think several of the NPCs are detailed enough to give some sort of dispense out some clues for players that can help point them on the right track. Other ones I found in this suffer from another kind of issue I've encountered with a lot of Arc Dream products is that there are NPCs that are really highlighted that don't really go anywhere. Specifically in terms of Lauren Harrogate's mother, it goes into great details that she saw all of these things, but is catatonic and will scream as soon as anyone approaches. So it's sort of, what are your players supposed to do with that? There's a lot of detail on Tommy Dangler's grandfather, Derek Wheeler, and all of his work in Peru and coming up with this IAPA idol and things like that. And I think that this can be a great source of dumping clues for players if you can find a way to naturally introduce it without just having them stumble on a oddly detailed Wikipedia article about some old archaeologist who didn't get his dissertation finished.
Before we get into reanimating this scenario, we'd like to contextualize our general experience with a victim of the art. I've run this for Into the Darkness, a YouTube gaming channel.
Right, I've run this scenario 3 times, and I have formatted it such that they are all 4-hour one-shots.
And I have only played in one of those 4-hour one shots. I've read through the scenario, but haven't had a chance to run it myself.
Excellent. So let's get into reanimation. Overall, how do we highlight the beating heart of this scenario? Lex.
I found that highlighting the heightening media presence in town, and especially the very annoying, nosy Phenomenex crews constantly following and hounding the agents or showing up at the worst possible times, is a really great way to increase the paranoia in terms of the agents need to be operating under the radar, and they have people that are very interested in following in their footsteps. So heightening a different angle of paranoia there. Also, something that Alex did whenever he ran the game that I did not realize was not actually written into the scenario, having the IAPA permanently stalking and flying around the town. As a player, I felt harassed and harried, and I did not feel safe or when I could keep my guard down. I found that cars were not safe. I wanted to hide in tunnels. So I think having the IAPA be out and about, even whenever Tommy Dangler may not be actively dreaming, but it's up to its own, it has its own agency and its own machinations, can do a lot to really highlight the theme that Alex brought up earlier of this cat and mouse and finding out who may be
Yeah,
hunting
and I think
whom.
Alex and I share that of upgrading the AAPA's intellect beyond what the original written scenario is, especially since it is a silent flying creature. I like to have it drop things on the players, whether that be cars that players are in, related minivans, telephone poles, really anything that you would like to see hurtling out of the sky.
I will also say there was something that Alex did, and Nathan, I'm curious if you brought into your games as well, that since the IAPA is silent, especially at night, to have rain be coming down, and then the agents may just notice that there is no rain in the area right around their car to really build that sort of quiet environmental paranoia.
And that's a theme I like to insert into scenarios when I run them, the theme of nature and the environment. So I've really enjoyed adding rain because it's very rich and evocative for your players to imagine. And it is also a setup for potential scares that you can use on your players, like Lex just described.
And speaking of that too, I hear Nathan, you are the cause of a couple of nightmares I may have had in terms of a scare outside of a window. You want to
Yes,
go into some
but
details on
for a
that?
little context, one of the aspects of the IAPA that I enjoy updating is the heads it takes. As written in the story, I believe it just discards them. Whereas when I've run it, it inserts the spinal column like a straw in a Capri Sun into its body, and then is just sucking on this lollipop while it roots around in the sky, which is fun when it begins to survey the players at night and it can bang previous victims' heads against the windows and have their dead eyes looking through silently.
Another theme that you could highlight is to use social media to add to the cruelty that is high school drama. Maybe Thomas Dengler is being made fun of in a group chat or on some other social media app where he's completely embarrassed by Lauren.
And I think that's an important thing to bring up is that you want to have some level of interaction between these different people that leads players towards a school connection. Maybe Dr. Moretti, the dentist victim, maybe he is primarily a children's dentist. The librarian is an obvious clue towards the school since she is the school librarian. But otherwise, it's easy to lose that connecting thread for players.
So I don't know. I kind of have some thoughts on that in terms of playing whenever it was a the most recent victim is a high school girl, then it was a librarian who was the next behind that, and then it was a dentist right behind that too. I felt like it was pretty quick, just especially seeing the high schooler and the librarian was enough to tip us off at the table that it was probably the school is where we needed to be looking or narrowing it down to. Definitely dropping in just another teenager or like high schooler victim would be more than enough to point in that direction. I do like the idea of making it say like a oh, what do they call them? Like a pediatrician dentist. And so focusing, as you said, like more on teenagers or children, stuff like that. Also, in terms of highlighting, as Alex was mentioning with the media, I think something that I want to bring into this game is the feeling of the town getting more and more crowded as time goes on, as there's already supposed to be a national news presence there whenever the players arrive, and then having more and more people show up as bodies are found as a way to really start pressing a ticking clock against the players that they will not be able to keep a lid on this very long if these sorts of things keep happening.
And that's a good way to bring in Phenomen X, which is actually one of the options in the core. You don't need it, but having this nosy group of investigators that are even passingly aware of the occult is very helpful for players that maybe miss some clues. It's great fun to have Phenomen X arrive at the Dangler house ahead of our Delta Green agents.
Yeah.
It's also great fun when the Phenomena X college students are live streaming their feed and they're just pointing their cameras at your agent's face, especially if one of them is officially signed on with the FBI, which is another option that you can take.
Yeah, I was really surprised in the text that Phenomenex is only supposed to show up for like a 3-day window or something. And personally, I would toss that out. Is it's really nice to have a media presence that's more formal and they're getting clustered into the public areas, but then having this more dogged type of investigators that are not afraid to really get into your agent's business and kind of be assholes when they need to be.
So let's talk a little bit about a change I know I've made, and I think, Alex, you might have as well. As written, the story starts out, I want to say a day or two after Lauren has already died.
Right. Mm-hmm.
I have it start, she disappeared the night before, and the agents actually find her body on the way into town alongside the detective and Phenomenex. So you have this meeting immediately of the body, and you can get that swell of the press starting to arrive and be interested.
And this is a perfect way to mesh and mold this scenario into a one shot where you're just going gas on the pedal.
I agree. As a player, I really liked introducing it's whenever unnatural things started happening before I was really expecting to manually discover them, driving on your way out to the case, and then there is a body tangled in power lines off to the side of the road, and the Phenomenex van is pointing their cameras at it, was a big, oh fuck moment for us. So yeah, I definitely recommend doing that. It was a great way to set the tone early on.
It's also a good hint that the perpetrator of these crimes is flying.
And I want to continue with that. Alex, you tend to run this in a 4-hour time frame. I believe I've had a couple longer ones that run around 6 or 8. How do we feel about stretching out the scenario? Giving this thing more time to stalk the players, giving them more time to have the media presence build. Is there anything you do to adjust for that?
Of course, I would definitely lay off the monster being so aggressive, because when you have this super aggressive monster, you're going to make your agents panic, and then they're going to make rash decisions like breaking into a school and getting into a gunfight with the janitor.
Did the janitor have a gun?
No.
The janitor didn't need a gun. The janitor whipped plenty of ass with his steel-toed boots.
Interesting.
I can say, in terms of playing it as a one shot, yes, it was very, as Alex said, it was sort of pedal to the metal. Once we got started, it was kind of boom, boom, boom. And we felt like we needed to wrap this up very quickly or we were going to die. I think a really good pace for the scenario would be maybe 2 sessions, maybe 3. But beyond that, I think that it may be going a bit too slow, and you could be taking more notion of having the creature sort of hunt around town. Something that I think could be a really helpful device for this is once the players go to investigate Lauren Harrowgate's home, maybe Tommy is still dreaming of her, especially in learning that she has disappeared. And so the AAPA may be sort of flying around her home and sees the agents sort of getting into its business. And it may start to feel like it itself is being hunted. And that is what sets the agents as targets for this creature, because instead there's not a lot of threat as written until the players start directly confronting Tommy and then allow him to go to sleep.
And that's usually where I bring it in is I have it surveilling from behind these storm clouds, and it understands at least at base level that it left clues behind. So when it sees agents drive away, it will follow them until, for example, they go to the coroner's and leave their car. Maybe they come back to the parking lot and their car is gone and is now in the bay or has been ripped apart. The roof is off in a field somewhere, and maybe a cell phone they collected, some piece of evidence, is now missing.
I can say one thread that we found, I don't know necessarily if this was intentional, Alex, but something that I liked as a detail to include was when this creature burst through Lauren Harrogate's French door balcony area, it left a lot of this gray Icarus substance from its skin sort of scraped on the boards outside. So my agent grabbed the Tupperware and tried to scoop it up like Ghostbusters style to take it back to the lab and analyze more of it. And whenever our car then got harried pretty shortly after this, I thought that it was because I had a sample of its skin or whatever, and that it could smell that. And I accidentally had it tracking us and put it on our trail. I think that's a great sort of, oh crap moment that your players might have.
So let's talk a little bit about Coral Nomad. I don't believe that we've used that option. Alex, did you use Coral Nomad at all?
I have never used the Coral Nomad option.
And I don't really think I will, honestly.
Why is that?
I think there is plenty in the scenario already in terms of threats from the media presence and being investigated by Phenomenon X and then having this creature around. Us as players, we were kept plenty busy with that. Throwing the additional wrench in of now your handler has you coordinate with this group that you need to arrange an extraction so that you can get the boy alive and then take him back to study it. Like, that might be entertaining, but unless you have a very experienced group that can breeze through most scenarios, I wouldn't bother.
By having so many factors in, you risk your players just having complete analysis paralysis, and that will stall your game, especially if you're trying to run a one shot.
That's a good point. I think that's something I encountered with Extremophilia.
I could see them being very useful in a long-term campaign. You just mentioned Extremophilia. It might be a good option to introduce them there and then reuse them as a continuing threat here. Maybe even they were at odds in a different scenario and now they are working together. That might be a fun option.
Oh, that's a great idea. Yeah.
So let's talk about what worked at the table and what didn't work.
I'm perfect. Nothing's wrong. Well,
I'll jump in. I think from my experience, having the AAPA harry the players was a very fun addition when they realized that they would be in threat anytime they were in the open sky. It was fun to drop small things at the start, and it led to a very fun climax when they took this pendant off of Thomas, and the creature, now free to attack, dropped a telephone pole through the child's chest in the house. That was a good wake-up moment for the agents when they realized that things had escalated past a point that they could control.
I agree. I can say in terms of a one shot that and like this is no fault of Alex's, it was a one shot. So like, yeah, I did feel that the creature was kind of too aggressive and it didn't quite make sense why we were being attacked before we really did anything. But besides that, if you have time to stretch this out into like maybe I said 2 sessions earlier, but like 8 hours of playtime, I think should be more than enough that you can have this creature sort of harass them and try to, if not kill them, get them away and out of its territory. and should be enough to get them pointing towards Tommy Dingler for a good showdown at his house. In terms of things that I think not so much didn't work at the table, but wouldn't work at the table as written. In Alex's game, he had an exhibit that featured Derek Wheeler's artifacts and things at another museum further up in New York. And so one of us needed to travel, I think it was an hour's drive or so, away from the action to look up and see if there was any kind of hints that it could provide about this thing. Once we found out that the boy was Tommy Dingler and trying to search through the media there. I think that was a really great way to give us the info dump because, as written, there is a lot of detail. I think there's a couple of pages of stuff all about Derek Wheeler's life and how he investigated these things and came up with this and then brought it back. And there is not really an organic way to introduce that otherwise. So having there be an exhibit or finding another way that you can have a clue dispenser around that can point agents toward this and give them some hints about the nature of this creature should do a lot to try and alleviate that analysis paralysis you mentioned earlier.
And I think that's a good point where having it be a one shot versus a longer exploration makes sense. Of if you had not been stalked actively by this creature, I think it would have made a lot more sense to lay low and do this research. Take a few days, let the press quiet down for a bit.
Well, that's
The immediate stalking just really puts a fuse to it.
and that's sort of where I can agree and disagree. I think that's something you can do to keep the heat on instead of if the players want to try and lay low and let the media quiet down, that's a great time to have another body show up in another very public place and to show that this situation is not going to resolve itself and that they still need to keep a foot on the gas in order to like resolve this before it gets way out of hand.
On the topic of finding this information in the museum, if you were pressed for time because you were running it in a 4-hour one shot, I would simply just convert it to something you'd just find on the internet.
Right. With it being modern times, that it's enough that you can maybe just search through the Wheelers. Maybe there was a local newspaper article or something, so you can start getting links to other names, maybe an obituary that mentions like he left his son, Derek Wheeler, I think that's his name, Dangler, with his inheritance. And like that can be enough of association to find in a local paper.
It's all about the pacing.
So here's a question for you. What were some really good moments you were able to bring into the games that you ran?
We had already discussed a bit about having Lauren's head bouncing from the top of the window at this motel as the rain was going around them, and having agents rush out and seeing some dark figure just float away backwards into the sky. That was a very fun scene for us and really drove home the sheer size of it because they'd never gotten a good look before. And when I run this, I usually have this thing be about the size of a bus.
So 3 of the times I've either run or played in this scenario, Phenomenex college students have ended up dead or worse. All from being there at the wrong time and getting machine gunned, or having a Delta Green agent get into a physical altercation and then getting beat up by a Phenomenex member and hospitalized, only for another agent to shotgun a Phenomenex person before they finish beating him up. It gets wild.
That's a wonderful, wonderful sanity loss, too, as they're taking out innocent bystanders.
There was also a point where agents really needed information on Thomas Dengler and his behavior in school. So they broke into the school and a janitor noticed them. There were 2 agents who were ganging up on this janitor, but they could not subdue or take him out, even with the assistance of a handgun. So the janitor managed to get out, jumping out of a window and driving away.
Yeah, we were all rolling really, really high that evening. That was why I had a very peaceful encounter with Phenomenex as I was playing an older gentleman and crashed into their car and faked, oh no, dad mixed up his heart medications. And so they were very kind and drove me to the hospital. I didn't try and kill or chloroform them because I did not put any points into any sort of combat skills. And yeah, I was not going to fail that badly in the middle of the road. I can say in terms of the scene that really still sticks out to me, it's the one that Nathan's mentioned a couple of times, is having the head knock on the window. That was a great moment whenever Alex ran it for us, and something that we really liked the day after was, and we were staying at a B&B and asked the proprietor if they had security cameras installed, and so she's like, oh yes, we have them locked up in here, and we failed persuasions to say like, okay, well, can we view these on our own? And so we had this old lady sitting and watching the security monitors showing this like this little head upside down balloon is dangling and moving around the perimeter of the building as one agent sort of grabs their gun and is just like, oh, are we doing this now? Having that kind of found footage tracking the thing as it's stalking them, I think could make some great moments in terms of, I did not know I was being hunted at that moment. And also, yeah, the using the environment to indicate where the thing might be without like outward hostility, having the rain stop around us was not a good place to be in.
One of my favorite moments when I was a player in Nathan's game was during his press conference for an FBI agent who was also a Delta Green agent. My agent was running a diversion for the media, and halfway throughout the press conference, all of these media types, they start looking at their phones, and they're looking up and they're asking the FBI agent, what about this new body that was just found on the east side? And then I rolled really well to confuse them. And I said, and I looked at my phone and I was like, what about the body that just appeared on the west side? And then everyone ran to the west side where there was no body.
That's a great example of tricking the media being almost more fun than engaging them in any sort of combat or chase. It's very satisfying, I think, to have people run off in the completely wrong direction for a while. One thing I was wondering about as well is we talked a little bit about how Sandra Harrogate is a bit of a dead end. She's severely traumatized by witnessing her daughter die, being ripped out of this second story bedroom, and she's nearly catatonic except for screaming if agents touch her. How would you guys adapt her to be less of a dead end and more of a leaping board?
He's clearly written as a red herring in this scenario as written. If I were to put a clue where she is, I'd have her maybe describe this colossal creature in the sky because she did get a glimpse at it. And having this description of this monster, especially earlier on when the agents don't know what they're dealing with, that can be really powerful. And besides, who's going to believe her? She's crazy.
Also, an idea that just occurred to me. This is sort of spinning off of how you ran it, Alex. But I think if you wanted to have Sandra Harrogate be involved, but maybe not have directly witnessed her daughter's abduction and not just be catatonic, she could have, grounded Lauren before then and taken her cell phone away from her, because it didn't really make sense for the police to not have had her cell phone if the mother had taken it beforehand and was so distraught and everything that she forgot that it was around. So whenever agents are investigating the house, they might hear the of notifications from the other side of the building and then find Lauren's cell phone in there. And it'd be a great way to give some clues without necessarily having her just spill the beans on everything.
Yeah, that's a great addition.
Yeah. And you could even have her have kept the cell phone into the asylum that she's located at if your players don't follow up at the house as much. That makes an excellent floating clue.
Exactly. Yeah. You can have that phone be just in her personal effects if they go and visit her at the asylum, and they can just mention that there and potentially confiscate it because it's an ongoing investigation. Yeah, as you said, it's a good floating clue. In terms of others, I think there is a lot written for the players to investigate the dentist and look into the client list and check in the answering machines and things. I was kind of surprised how much answering machines and voicemails were referenced in this because we never even touched on that. We latched on much more into a librarian and a high school student were just found dead. We were like, okay, cool. So the dentist is related somehow, but we're going to follow up on the school lead. So I definitely think fleshing out the school angle more will be helpful. So you see more prepared whenever your players will likely try and follow that up.
So I'd like to talk about that clue a little bit of the phone records, because I think that's an interesting use of a clue that needs to be touched multiple times. In the case of the dentist's office, I usually say, yes, the players can get a list of the patients, and it will be mostly students, but it doesn't really help them. I don't even give them a list of names at that point because it would be impossible to follow up on all of them. However, when they get Lauren's phone or they research at the school with the librarian, that's when that clue becomes critical and they can begin to cross reference names and cut down to common factors.
I like that idea.
And that's where you'd see Tommy's name come up.
Yeah, especially being able to cross reference between two seemingly disparate clues and look around through there. That was something that Alex did whenever he ran it. Was when we finally cracked into Lauren Harrogate's phone, it was completely full with all of these texts and commiserations where people texting like, I'm so sorry to a dead girl. And so it was just the one text that really stuck out to us was whenever it was from Tommy Harrogate and it just said, I'm sorry. And as a player, I was wondering, like, am I really just going to browse through every single text that this girl sent and received in order to find something? Because it's just going to be overwhelming. So either picking off some kind of very suspicious text like that, or like you mentioned, Nathan, being able to cross-reference to start narrowing it down to a selection of names.
And if you wanted to have your players say that they wanted to spend a day looking through these texts, I might give them that Thomas's texts seem a bit strange when viewed from that level of detail, but having that comparison works a little bit faster.
Or on the other side, if they're going to spend the whole day browsing through these texts, Lauren may not be the nicest person in the world and might have a sort of group chat with her friends saying, oh my God, that fucking nerd just asked me out. And then a lot of jokes about that. Being able to browse through and find it that way gives motive too.
She could definitely have done a public humiliation TikTok.
Timely, I love it. So let's do some rapid fire GM advice based on our experiences. Alex, you've run it most recently. What are some quick tips that you would throw at players and GMs?
If you're running it in a one shot, keep up the pace by having the monster drop bodies. But also keep in mind that the deaths should relate to Thomas Stengler.
My advice for this scenario is keep an eye on lethality. This monster could easily kill players almost immediately. So having a light hand at the damage it does is important. Keep it just at the edge, just always watching and maybe causing enough injury to be concerning, but not enough to derail the entire scenario.
Especially early on in the scenario, I think that's a great time, as you mentioned, to have the monster knock over telephone poles and knock a car around or something. Things that could cause broken glass for like a D4, a D6, or like a phone pole crashes into your car. I think that was maybe a D8 or a D10 of damage. So it's not enough to likely one shot your players. You can save that towards the end. It's always more satisfying to die in the big final confrontation than early on.
This bad boy has a lethality of 15% for its bite. Save that for the climax.
And my other advice for this with this creature is don't give the players easy answers. When they get the amulet and they see it on Thomas, they should have no idea if they can just take it from him, if they have to destroy it, if they have to hold it on them. That is not information that is available to them. And that level of confusion and insufficient data makes up for some really fun conflict as this creature is barreling through the house.
Here's a question. How do y'all tend to recommend running Tommy Dangler when the agents meet up with him? Should he be more antagonistic? Should he be neutral? What about if he learns, if the agents just outright tell him about this or try and talk the necklace off of him? How would you run him that way?
So I would run Thomas as very, very sympathetic because I do love the moral angle of, do we just kill this teenage kid who has his entire life ahead of him, especially since he's not really the cause of the freaky shit that's going on around. And if the agents did tell him that this necklace allowed him to control some super monster, well, you just told a teenager who is super easy to get power hungry that he has this power to do whatever he wants with this monster. And I think that that should fall out accordingly.
Kind of makes me want to watch Death Note.
Well, and you've just upset this teenager by telling him this. That to me is a perfect time for the monster to expand the scope of their commands and maybe take care of a few of the agents to lessen the concern on Tommy. But yes, I also play him as a very sympathetic kid, not so much devious as oblivious and in pain. I think if you were to play him as a more antagonistic child, it would be easier for players to basically kill him at the end and not feel as guilty. And that would really rob them of a very fun ethical dilemma.
That's a good point by making that soft spot that they don't really want to kill him, but like as a player, I didn't know what would happen with him, so it was easier just to take him out of the picture and not take any chances. I also didn't know how close this creature was to him, if it would be around whenever we confronted him directly. So I remember I was advocating someone to buy a deer rifle and just try and pick the kid off whenever he was walking to the bus or something.
And I actually had a group that didn't take the necklace from him. They actually drove Thomas and Mark out into a field where they thought they would have a good view of this before they took the amulet and destroyed it. At that point, I had the creature swoop down on the car that had Thomas and Mark and fly off with it, never to be seen again, which led to some helplessness sanity rolls.
So, are there any ideas that you two might have to expand on the scenario as written more in terms of other interesting victims that you might want to bring up? Personally, I keep toying with the idea of maybe Tommy is applying for different colleges and there is a college refusal letter that he gets in the mail. And so he has a dream about whoever this person is that denied his college application. And there's a random killing like way out in Kansas or something. And it does not seem relevant at all, except that the modus operandi was the same. And so then maybe whenever they find that letter, that's a big aha moment later on. But if you feel like that might distract players too much, then like that's more of a red herring kind of than anything.
How would you get them to be aware of this killing if it's far away?
Well, as written, this is already sort of a big thing in the news, especially as Alex mentioned that whenever a blonde teenage cheerleader goes missing, the world stops and all of the media attention was focused on her. So then, since this is already in the public eye, another very similar case might be enough to like that could be something to bring up at the press conference if they think that there's a copycat killer or something.
Ah, excellent.
So I'd like to add another body, and with this in mind, let's make it tragic. How about, and this requires a little bit of setup, but why don't we have Thomas have a best friend, and maybe he's comforting him throughout the breakout, but perhaps further along the agent's investigation, Thomas gets into an argument with his best friend. And when his best friend ends up dead, that is a lot of good material you can work with.
I like that. I was also just thinking, what if Thomas dreams of getting something? As these IOPAs are supposed to be sort of servitors, and whenever someone would want to have a temple built, this would stack a bunch of giant stones up to build these temples and wherever. But what if maybe Tommy is wanting the school to burn down? And so there is this like destruction at the school building, and the IOPA demands its price and snatches Tommy's father out of the backyard or something, in terms of like now there is this very chaotic thing and still creating. Tommy does not know what's happening or why, and he seems like as much of a victim of this as anyone else.
That's a wonderful source of guilt for him later on if the agents tell him about his father's death. I like that a lot. In terms of expanding it, I think the easiest is if the agents keep the amulet. So if I was to run this in a longer form, I might make the amulet a bit more difficult to destroy. So then players have to decide if one of them will take up the amulet, if they'll just pass it along to their handler. That's an interesting discussion for them to have.
I think if they pass it to the handler and then suddenly find more killings like that in the news, that's a big sanity roll incoming, in terms of, oh, great, I just handed a stealth nuke off to someone doing crazy murders around the country now.
That's the next mission.
That was going to be the next mission for us. We actually had a player that instead of shooting the kid, he took the necklace off and put the necklace on him and ordered the creature to stop. The creature stopped. And as his teammate is waking up and the teammate says, just kill him, end this, he sicks the servitor on the teammate because he can't bear to kill an innocent child. And so the kid runs away. His dad's dead. His home's destroyed. And now my cowardly agent is tasked with hunting this rogue one down, who is, now has a mind-controlled killer pet.
Unlucky.
One other issue that I had with the scenario is, even from the initial teaser blurb and the main setup, is that the coroner has found some sort of strange grayish substance underneath the fingernails of the victims. And I, as a player, I created my agent to investigate this because this seemed like an interesting angle to bring up. However, as written, there's not a whole lot to dive into. It's unnatural. It doesn't follow known chemical compositions. It's weird. And like, okay, for something that's teased so heavily in the premise, it sort of just felt like a dead end. So I was really curious how you two might try and make more of that, if you have already in your games, or how else you might try and expand on that.
Well, I had a couple of players that rolled up with scientist characters, and after the analysis of the material, rolled quite well on their science rolls to basically create a counter acidic agent for this biology. They seemed confident in the science, whether I knew it or not, so I rolled with it, and they ended up with super soakers that they could use against the creature if it gets close enough, which was an excellent way for them to have an encounter where they were able to escape quickly. But at the end of the day, this thing just stays further away and throws things for the next encounter. So it doesn't overpower them, but gives them an excellent encounter and a get out of jail free card.
Sure, I like that. Yeah, like in terms of if they're going to be more involved and investigative, it can give some sort of a boon that maybe squirting it with a bomb of this basic substance to cancel out the chemicals that are in the nature can stun it for a round, giving them enough time to skedaddle without, as you said, like just, oh no, I'm melting.
Lose a tendril or two,
No.
but keep the core.
So another thing that you could expand in this scenario are the NPCs themselves, especially the detective, Hannah Gregson, and Dr. Steven Santorini. Originally, they're written as characters that give you information, that dispense information. You could expand them to potentially be roadblocks, or you can go a step further and make them a little more complex by having them become potential Delta Green friendlies. But That all depends how they handle the unnatural and what your agents do.
Yeah, I think that's how you sort of brought in, that's how you brought in with Hannah Gregson, that she, one of her deputies was the next body to be found at the river. And so whenever she got his dash cam footage and was looking at this, she was shaken and was sort of seeming like she was asking our agents, like, what even is this? Like, what the hell do I do here? And keying it up that she could be a potential friendly and can be an asset if they play their cards right. I think that there's a lot to expand on with her in there. How would you make Dr. Santorini a bigger role? I know you made him a friendly in our game, Alex. Is there anything else that you would bring in?
So I made him a friendly to accommodate the one-shot style that I go with. So make him a friendly. Perhaps you could have Dr. Santorini already trying to cover up this gray substance that is found on the deceased of the Glenridge chiropractor. And should the agents notice that, they could commend him for hiding it.
He'd be an excellent
You've
recurring.
been promoted. Join us on the next mission.
He'd be an excellent recurring character, actually, if you play him as extremely sympathetic towards their needs. I could absolutely see them going back to him when they run into some other cadaver that they need inspected.
Alternatively, you could run him as a fame-hungry asshole to have him as an adversary for the agents.
Find as they are sort of browsing in his office that maybe he has a manuscript draft on his computer with this new chemical analysis of this substance. He might tell them that he doesn't know anything about it, but then they find all of this equipment that he has been testing and trying to make a bigger name for himself. How would you expand on the librarian more? Or does she really need to be expanded on? Is it enough to just find a pink slip in the school saying that, oh, yeah, she's the one that gave Tommy detention? Or is there anything else that you would want to bring into that?
I usually just run her more or less as written. I tend to dial back a bit on how strict she is, unless you have players that really have no interest in her. Because if she's too strict, then it's very difficult to buy, it's difficult to spot the person on the list. Whereas maybe Tommy just rubbed her the wrong way one day and she finally snapped.
Alternatively, you could go the other way and have Tommy have a perfect attendance, perfect behavioral record, and that one mar would highlight that something went wrong.
Or it could be something more severe than just going into detention, sort of going into that, that maybe she recommended him for in school suspension or like some sort of way overreaching punishment that would be undeserving to give him a much bigger reason to have those angry teenage dreams that would then cause her to be despinulated.
It might be interesting to use that as an avenue for bringing in the Peruvian research as well. If Thomas perhaps had checked out all of these historical books to research and was adamantly refusing to bring them back in, that might be another way to clue them in that there's something strange going on with him.
And that's a really great point to bring in an additional clue to give them some context. If for whatever reason that maybe Tommy just did a report on archaeological stuff that his grandfather did, and that could be a floating clue that they might be able to find around the high school or something of that nature. Or it could be, what if Vanessa Hatvan is not a librarian? Maybe she is his history teacher and she gave him a D on the project because he didn't use any peer-reviewed sources, because he used all of his grandfather's journals and things for the report. And so because of that, that marred his record, and that's why, but also can point him in that direction.
I would warn that should you use this method, this would imply that Thomas would know the significance of the artifact that he has around his neck.
Oh, so that's a good point. Maybe it would just be a report about how his grandfather was an archaeologist and looked into Peruvian things, but never really got into the details of the nitty gritty.
That's why you got a D.
Well, I don't necessarily agree there, as I could see him actually have discussing and figuring out this artifact, but not having put together that these beheadings are related to him. I mean, he's basically in a drug haze due to his root canal, and maybe he just doesn't believe that sort of thing. I do like the idea of using the grandfather as a primary source, though, and losing points because of that. It seems that right kind of unfair that a good student would really take to heart.
Right. And especially if he's trying to apply for colleges and then getting that would actually bring him, instead of an A, he's going to get an A minus or even a B in
Possible.
class. And like that, you just can't have that for college apps these days.
We hope our deranged utterings are helpful in bringing this game to life at your table. You can join the autopsy discussion on Discord and subscribe or follow the podcast to hear more gruesome tales. So until next time, thanks for listening to RPG Reanimators
Where your games can die.
Or live.
on the table.
Cut.
Good idea. Good idea.
Yeah.
Well, let's get into reanimation. Yeah. Pause for it. Edit.
No.
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 Oh, God. Ah.
We're gonna have to cut that in post.
Yeah. I agree.